Welcome to the deep dive. Today, you're joining us for, well, a really big picture look at humanity's journey from, relatively insignificant animals to, well, beings who sometimes act like gods.
Yeah, it's quite the story. And our main source for this deep dive is Yuval Noah Harari's book *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*. We're drawing heavily on the insights from that. It's also available in Turkish, by the way.
And it really does try to cover almost everything, doesn't it? I mean, from the cognitive revolution, how we started thinking differently through agriculture, and all the way up to the scientific revolution, and, well, where we are now. It's a lot.
It is a huge sweep of history, and that's kind of our goal today, for you to pull out the really key ideas. Those moments Harari identifies as shaping who we are. Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to understanding these massive changes.
Okay, let's dive in then. Starting way, way back, like 13.5 billion years ago, Harari says.
Yeah,
The Big Bang.
right. The start of everything matter: energy, time, space, the absolute basics. But for our story, we need to zoom in on us, on humans, and specifically the brain.
That amazing and apparently very expensive brain.
Exactly. Harari really highlights this. It's only, what, 2–3% of our body weight? But it uses a massive 25% of our energy when we're just resting.
25%. That's huge compared to other apes, right?
Oh, absolutely. They're down around 8%. So yeah, it's incredibly energy hungry.
Which must have meant trade-offs for early humans, like needing more food, maybe less muscle.
That's exactly the point Harari makes. He says humans basically transferred energy from biceps to neurons, more time finding food, weaker muscles.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily the obvious winning strategy right away.
Huh. And then there's the whole thing about human babies being so helpless for so long.
Right. Which seems like a drawback, but Harari links it directly to our social abilities and how incredibly adaptable and teachable we are. That long childhood is crucial for learning culture.
So more time to learn more complex societies. And it connects to our hands too, doesn't it? Developing those fine motor skills.
Precisely. That prolonged dependency pushes the development of intricate hand skills, which then lets us make better tools. We see the earliest evidence, like 2.5 million years ago. It's a key thing archaeologists look for.
And all this while walking upright, which also had its own pros and cons.
Yeah, bipedalism freed the hands, which was massive.
Yeah.
But it also gave us things like back pain and made childbirth more dangerous. Trade-offs again.
So with this big brain starting to develop, but maybe weaker bodies, where did we actually fit in the food chain initially? We weren't always at the top, were we?
Not even close, for a very long time. Harari paints this picture of early humans as being kind of mid-level scavengers, waiting for the lions to finish, then darting in to grab leftovers, competing with hyenas.
Wow. That must have shaped our psychology, being prey as much as predator.
Almost certainly. Our anxieties, our social structures, maybe they have roots back there. But then came a game changer: cooking.
Ah, yes. Fire and cooking. How big a deal was that?
Huge. Cooking basically pre-digests food. It meant shorter intestines, which saved energy. And where did that saved energy go?
Straight to the energy-hungry brain.
Exactly. Both for sapiens and Neanderthals. Harari argues controlling fire was maybe the first major jump separating us from other animals. Suddenly, we had power outside our own bodies.
Okay, so fire, bigger brains. But then we get to what feels like the core of Harari's argument about sapiens specifically. Our ability to believe in things that aren't, well, physically real. Fiction, shared stories.
This is absolutely central. Our unique knack for creating and believing in collective myths. Gods, nations, money, corporations, human rights, things you can't touch or see.
And he uses the Peugeot car company example, right? It exists because we all agree it does, legally, financially. It's a shared story.
Precisely. Or the Catholic priest performing Mass. The power there comes entirely from shared belief. These shared fictions allow cooperation on a scale no other animal can manage.
So it's not just about better tools, but better coordination because we believe the same stories.
That's the key. Our tools didn't change that dramatically for ages, but our ability to organize did. Believing in these shared, imagined realities lets hundreds, thousands, even millions of strangers work together. It's our superpower, in a way.
And these stories can be incredibly varied, like the Bari tribe idea about multiple fathers for one child. It shows how flexible these social constructs are.
It really does. And it also highlights how hard it is to know what ancient hunter-gatherers really believed. Without writing, we're guessing. Harari's analogy is trying to understand today's teens just from their postal mail. You'd miss almost everything.
Right, the texts, the social media. So what do we know about that hunter-gatherer lifestyle?
Well, we know they generally lived in small, intimate bands, maybe a few dozen people. They were nomadic, moving within large territories, following food sources,
Constantly on the move?
pretty much. Though sometimes the groups would explore or expand, maybe due to conflict, climate change, or just curiosity. That's how humans spread across the planet.
But it wasn't necessarily a peaceful, easy life, was it? Harari points out the tougher side, too.
Definitely not in Eden. There's evidence for violence. He mentions practices like infanticide among some groups, like the ache, likely driven by harsh necessity. And abandoning the sick or elderly who couldn't keep up, survival was brutal.
And their worldview is very different, too. Animism.
Yeah, the belief that pretty much everything, animals, plants, rivers, rocks, storms, had awareness, spirit, intentions. You had to communicate with them, negotiate.
Yeah.
The world was alive with non-human persons.
Including things like spirits, demons, fairies, a much more enchanted world than most of us experience today.
A very different reality. And we do have physical evidence of conflict back then. Skeletons from before agriculture, found in places like Portugal, Israel, the Danube Valley. They show injuries from weapons.
Like that Natufian site he mentions, with lots of skeletons showing violence.
Exactly. A startlingly high percentage, almost 40%, showed signs of violence, arrowheads embedded in bone, that kind of thing. And there's the Offnet Cave in Germany.
Oh, that one sounds grim.
It is. The remains of 38 people, men, women, children, all showing signs of violence, blunt force trauma. It suggests conflict wasn't just occasional. It could be brutal and widespread.
Still, even with finds like that, there's so much we just don't know about their lives, their thoughts.
Absolutely. Archaeology gives us glimpses, but the full picture, it's lost to time before writing.
Okay, so moving forward in time then, we hit the next massive shift, the agricultural revolution.
Right, starting around 9500 to 8500 BCE.
Yeah.
First in the Fertile Crescent, that's southeastern Turkey, Iran, the Levant, and then popping up independently elsewhere, like China, the Americas.
And you'd think, okay, farming, settling down, more food, that must have been a huge improvement, right?
That's the conventional wisdom. But Harari really challenges it. He argues that for the average person, early agriculture might have actually made life harder.
Harder? How?
Well, diets often became less varied. You're relying on one or two staple crops, like wheat. If that fails, you starve. Hunter-gatherers usually had more options.
Ah, okay. More risk of famine.
Right. And farming was often more work than foraging. Clearing fields, planting, weeding, harvesting. It's back-breaking stuff compared to the perhaps more varied rhythm of hunting and gathering.
And living close together in villages. Diseases must have spread more easily.
Definitely. Sanitation wasn't great, and dense populations are breeding grounds for epidemics. Plus, agriculture paved the way for surplus food, which led to hierarchies, inequality. Some people controlling the food stores, others having less.
So it was kind of a trap. It seemed like a good idea, maybe offered a bit more food security initially, but it locked people into a tougher life with new problems.
That's exactly what Harari calls the luxury trap. Each small improvement seemed logical, but collectively they led to a harder existence for many, with more labor, worse health, and social divisions.
And did farming make people less violent?
The evidence suggests. Not necessarily, at least not right away. Harari mentions anthropological studies of more recent farming groups, like in New Guinea or Ecuador, where violence levels could be extremely high.
So the idea of settling down leading to peace is maybe too simplistic.
It seems so. Widespread peace, or at least the control of violence by larger authorities, seems to be linked more to the later development of states, kingdoms, much larger political units, which took thousands of years after agriculture started.
But there must have been some advantages to village life for those early farmers.
Oh, sure. You could cooperate on big tasks, defend yourselves better against predators or enemies, store food for lean times, develop specialized tools like sickles, grinding stones.
And you mentioned the Natufians earlier. They were kind of in between.
Yeah, they're fascinating. They lived before full-blown agriculture, but started settling down, harvesting wild grains intensively, building permanent structures. A real transition phase.
It's amazing to think about, and Harari makes that point, doesn't he, that even now, with all our tech, we still have hunter-gatherer minds in many ways, and our diets are based on those first farmed plants.
It's quite humbling, yeah. We're running Stone Age emotions and instincts on modern hardware, basically. And still eating wheat, rice, corn, the same stuff domesticated thousands of years ago.
While the pace of change now is just insane compared to back then.
Oh, completely. Think about communication. For millennia, information traveled at the speed of a person walking or a horse running, then boom, telegraph, phone, internet. The world shrinks incredibly fast. change accelerates exponentially.
Which leads us to how these growing, settled societies started to connect and eventually unify. Harari talks about imagined orders again here, right?
Exactly. These shared belief systems, laws, religions, political ideologies, economic principles are what allow huge numbers of strangers who've never met to cooperate. They're the glue holding large societies together.
Like the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Babylon, or the American Declaration of Independence talking about equality.
Perfect examples. Neither Hammurabi's laws nor the idea that all men are created equal are, objective biological facts. They are stories, powerful narratives we collectively agree to live by. And sometimes, enforcing those stories requires force, like the American Civil War, fought largely over the meaning of that equality clause.
Right, it's not just belief, sometimes it's enforced. That quote about bayonets comes to mind. You can do a lot with them, but you can't sit on them comfortably. You need people to actually buy in.
Precisely. And the really clever part, Harari argues, is how these imagined orders shape our desires. We're born into them. What we want, romantic love, a big house, patriotic feelings, the latest gadget, these desires often perfectly align with and reinforce the prevailing order.
So our own personal dreams become defenders of the system.
In a way, yes. Think about consumerism. The desire for new things fuels the capitalist engine. It feels personal, but it serves the larger imagined order.
And these orders often create hierarchies, don't they? Justifying why some groups have more power or status than others.
Absolutely. Harari gives many examples. The caste system in India, justified by the myth of Purusha's body parts. Aristotle arguing some people are naturally slaves.
Even supposedly scientific justifications, like racist theories about biological differences.
Yes, those were very powerful imagined orders, using the language of science to prop up social prejudices. Nazi ideology is a horrific example. Or myths like the Chinese goddess Nuwa, creating aristocrats from yellow earth and commoners from mud. These stories explain and legitimize inequality.
But they're ultimately just stories, arbitrary distinctions.
Completely arbitrary from a biological standpoint. There's no Brahmin gene or Shudra gene. These are divisions created and maintained by laws, customs, and beliefs by the imagined order.
And ideas like purity and pollution often get used to police these boundaries.
Very effectively. Defining certain groups or activities as impure is a powerful way to enforce social distance and hierarchy. It's been used across cultures and history.
And these systems tend to reinforce themselves, right? Discrimination creates disadvantages, which are then pointed to as proof of the original prejudice.
Exactly. It becomes a vicious cycle. Harari uses the example of the post-Civil War South in the U.S., where laws and social norms created economic and educational barriers for Black Americans, and the resulting poverty was then used by racists to prove their supposed inferiority.
It's fascinating and depressing. Harari also talks about gender in this context, distinguishing biological sex from the social construct of gender.
Right. What's considered masculine or feminine behavior varies enormously across cultures and time periods. Think about women in ancient Athens versus modern Athens. The expectations are totally different.
So the idea that biology rigidly dictates gender roles, that's another myth.
According to Harari, yes. While there are biological differences between sexes, the vast array of roles, expectations, and temperaments assigned to men and women are primarily cultural constructs, part of the imagined order, not hardwired by genes. There's no patriarchy gene.
And these imagined orders, even with all their contradictions like knights valuing both piety and violence, or modern democracies juggling freedom and security, they actually drive history forward.
Yes, the internal tensions and contradictions within these systems often fuel change, debate, and conflict, pushing societies in new directions. They give people complex motivations.
Isolation also plays a role. Tasmania is the example he uses.
Yeah, a stark example.
Yeah.
Cut off from mainland Australia for thousands of years, the Tasmanians had a very different technological and cultural trajectory. It shows how much human development relies on connection and exchange.
Yet, despite all that historical diversity, Harari argues we're now moving towards a single global culture.
Increasingly so, yes. Not that everyone lives the same way, obviously, but there's a growing shared layer of understanding science, medicine, politics, economics, even concepts of time that operates globally.
And money is maybe the ultimate example of a global imagined order.
Probably the most successful one ever. Pieces of paper, metal coins, digital entries. They have value purely because billions of strangers trust that other strangers will accept them. It's pure shared belief, pure trust.
Empires also helped spread these shared orders, didn't they?
Definitely. Empires, through conquest and administration, spread languages, laws, religions, and cultural norms over vast areas. Think of the Roman Empire, or even early ones like the Akkadian Empire. The idea of universal rule persisted long after the empires themselves collapsed.
And within empires, there's cultural mixing and change. Gandhi's story in South Africa is a powerful case study.
Right. He went there adopting British ways, faced discrimination, and that experience became crucial in forging his own identity and his later philosophy of resistance. Empires create these complex encounters.
And then there are the major world religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism spreading their own imagined orders across continents.
Huge unifying forces, offering shared cosmology, ethics, rituals, and a sense of belonging to millions, transcending local identities.
Though Harari notes, polytheism was often more tolerant than monotheism.
Generally, yes. Polytheistic systems could often incorporate new gods relatively easily. Monotheism, asserting one exclusive truth, tended to be less accommodating. Though, as Harari points out, even monotheisms often absorbed older gods or spirits in the form of saints or minor deities.
And besides religion, we have other secular religions now, like humanism.
Yes, he discusses humanism as another major imagined order, placing ultimate value on humanity itself. But it has different branches. Liberal humanism focusing on individual liberty, socialist humanism on collective equality, and evolutionary humanism.
It's important to remember that link, how science or pseudoscience was used to justify prejudice.
Crucial. Scientific ideas, even wrong ones, don't exist in a vacuum. They reflect and sometimes reinforce the social and political biases of their time.
Okay, that brings us to the final big one, the scientific revolution. What made this revolution different?
According to Harari, the absolute key difference was the willingness to admit ignorance, to say, we don't know. Before this, knowledge was mostly seen as coming from ancient texts or divine revelation.
So instead of assuming all the answers were already out there, science started saying, let's go find out.
Exactly. Through observation, experimentation, and using mathematical tools to describe findings, it was a fundamental shift in the approach to knowledge.
And Harari links this tightly to capitalism and empire building, right?
Inextricably linked. He argues that modern science and modern economies both run on a belief in progress and future growth. Scientific breakthroughs could lead to new technologies, which could generate profits and political power.
So governments and businesses started funding science because they expected a return on investment.
Precisely. They funded explorations, research, inventions, hoping for practical benefits, better weapons, new medicines, faster production methods, access to new resources. It created a feedback loop.
And the impact of new technologies was enormous. The steam engine, for example.
Revolutionized everything: industry, transport, warfare. Though interestingly, its potential wasn't immediately grasped or adopted everywhere outside Europe, which further widened the gap.
And science was often physically part of the imperial project.
Very often. Think of Napoleon taking scientists to Egypt, or Darwin sailing on the HMS Beagle, a naval survey ship. Exploration and mapping were crucial for both scientific knowledge and colonial control. Scientists collected data, specimens, mapped territories. Knowledge was power, literally.
Which helps explain how Europe managed to dominate so much of the globe during that period.
That technological and organizational edge, fueled by this combination of science, capital, and imperial ambition, was a major factor. Harari notes that most non-European powers lacked that global vision, that drive to explore and map the entire world until much later.
Even things like deciphering ancient scripts, like cuneiform.
Driven largely by European scholars, funded often by imperial interests or institutions benefiting from empire. The discovery of the Indo-European language family, linking languages from India to Ireland again, a product of this European-led scientific curiosity, intertwined with their growing global reach.
And the whole economic system shifted, too, with the rise of credit.
Yes, the belief in the future. Pre-modern economies mostly assumed the pie was fixed. Modern capitalism runs on the idea that the pie can grow, that future investments will generate more wealth. Credit lending money based on trust and future returns became essential.
The Dutch Republic was an early pioneer here.
A key example. They built a powerful economy based on trust, credit, property rights, and institutions like the stock market. This allowed for massive mobilization of capital.
And things like the joint stock companies, the VOC.
The Dutch East India Company, yeah. These limited liability companies could raise huge amounts of capital and undertake incredibly ambitious and often brutal global ventures. They became almost states in their own right, waging wars, colonizing territories like Indonesia. The British East India Company and the Opium Wars in China are another example.
So capital, politics, and even war got deeply entangled.
Completely. Harari uses the example of the Battle of Navarino Bay, where European powers intervened in the Greek War of Independence, partly influenced by investors who had bought Greek bonds. Finance shaped geopolitics.
But this growth had a very dark side, too.
A horrific dark side. King Leopold's rule over the Congo Free State is one of the most brutal examples, pure exploitation for rubber, leading to unimaginable suffering and millions of deaths. Economic growth often came at a terrible human and environmental cost.
And the discovery of fossil fuels, especially oil.
Another massive game changer. Cheap, portable energy that transformed transportation, industry, warfare, and global politics in the 20th century and beyond.
So this brings us closer to the present. And Harari starts asking some really challenging questions about where science and technology might be taking us, especially regarding our ideas about ourselves, humanism.
Yeah, the scientific worldview starts to chip away at some core humanist assumptions. The idea of human uniqueness, the supreme importance of our subjective feelings. Science offers different perspectives.
Like the Harlow monkey experiments.
Right, showing that emotional needs like comfort and affection could be even more critical for well-being than basic physical needs like food. It suggested complex inner lives in other animals.
And the scientific view of happiness, less about achievements, more about brain chemistry.
Increasingly, yes. From a purely biological perspective, happiness is about biochemical reactions, neurotransmitters, which opens the door, theoretically, to manipulating happiness chemically, regardless of external circumstance.
Which feels unsettling. And then there's biotechnology, genetic engineering. He mentions Alba, the green fluorescent rabbit.
A very visible, kind of quirky example of our ability to literally rewrite the genetic code of life. It signals a profound new level of control, or potential control, over biology.
Leading towards cyborgs, blurring the line between biology and technology.
We're already there in many ways. Think bionic ears, sophisticated prosthetic limbs controlled by nerve signals. He mentions Jesse Sullivan and Claudia Mitchell. Even brain-computer interfaces allowing people, or monkeys in experiments like Aurora, to control devices with thought alone.
And huge projects trying to map or even recreate the brain.
Like the Human Brain Project. The ambition is enormous, potentially even simulating consciousness in a computer someday.
Which leads to that mind-bending idea of the technological singularity.
The hypothetical point where artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence, leading to runaway technological growth that we can't predict or control. It could mean, well, the end of Homo sapiens as we know it.
The Frankenstein prophecy, as Harari puts it, our creations surpassing us.
Exactly. The fear that we might unleash forces we can't manage. And the point Harari makes is that history doesn't really help us predict what will happen next in such a scenario.
So history isn't about predicting the future.
Not really, he argues. Its value is more in broadening our horizons, understanding how things could have been different, how the way we live and think now isn't inevitable, but the result of countless historical contingencies. It helps us question our present assumptions.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered a massive span here, from the dawn of consciousness and shared stories, through the agricultural revolution that reshaped society, the forces unifying humankind, and right up to this potentially transformative, maybe even scary future driven by science and technology.
It's an incredible journey Sapiens has been on. And it really does leave you wondering, doesn't it? Harari lays out these huge trends, the power of fictions, the acceleration of change, the merging of biology and technology.
So the final thought to leave everyone with, perhaps, considering this dizzying pace, what completely unimagined realities might be just around the corner for humankind? What happens next in this story?
Exactly. Based on everything we've seen about how radically things can change, what possibilities, maybe even ones we can barely conceive of now, might shape our future. It's definitely something to mull over.